Hi there, this is MC Time Trackers. Welcome to our channel, where history meets English learning. Every story you hear is not just about the past, but also a way to feel, to understand, and to grow your English naturally. So stay with us till the end, listen, feel, and let the stories of time guide your English journey. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell to travel through history with us every week. Part 1. Dawn of the Nile Civilization. Long before the rise of Rome or the glory of Greece, there was a kingdom so mysterious and magnificent that it seemed to have been built by gods rather than men. Its monuments pierced the sky, its rulers were worshipped as divine, and its people lived by the rhythm of the most life-giving river on earth. Hello and welcome to MC Time Trackers. Make sure you watch the entire video, because every story we uncover today will reveal secrets of ancient Egypt you won't want to miss. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell that way. If you miss any part, you can come back and catch it later, and you'll be the first to explore our next thrilling episode. This was ancient Egypt, a land where time itself seemed to move differently, where life, death, and the afterlife were parts of one endless circle. They called their homeland Kemet, the Black Land. It was named after the rich, dark soil left behind when the Nile River flooded each year. In a world dominated by harsh desert, this black earth meant life, stability, and renewal. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river. It was the pulse of the universe. The gift of the Nile. The Nile River stretches over 6,600 kilometers, making it the longest river in the world. Its waters flow northward, cutting through barren sands before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Every year, between the months we now call June and September, the river would rise, overflow its banks, and then retreat, leaving behind layers of fertile silt. To the Egyptians, this annual flood wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a sacred promise, a gift from the gods. Without the Nile, there could be no Egypt. The river gave them water to drink, fish to eat, fertile land for crops, and a natural highway for travel and trade. Early settlers learned to harness the river's cycles, creating irrigation systems and reservoirs that allowed them to farm even in dry seasons. By around 5000 BCE, small farming villages dotted the valley. Over the next 2 millennia, these settlements grew, connected by trade and shared belief in the river's divine power. But as villages turned into city-states, rivalry followed. Kings of Upper Egypt, the southern part, and Lower Egypt, the northern delta, vied for control. Then, around 3100 BCE, a powerful ruler named Narmer, also known as Menes, achieved what no one before him had done. He unified Egypt into one kingdom. This was the birth of the First Dynasty, and with it, the world's first centralized state. Narmer's unification was not only political but also symbolic. He wore the double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, representing the merging of two lands under one divine ruler. From this union would grow one of the greatest civilizations in human history, the birth of kingship and divine order. In Egypt, kings were never just rulers, they were gods made flesh. The pharaoh was believed to be the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, and the son of Ra, the sun god. His role wasn't just to govern, but to maintain Ma'at, the sacred balance between order and chaos, truth and falsehood, life and death. This idea, Ma'at, became the moral backbone of Egyptian civilization. Farmers, priests, soldiers all saw their duties as contributing to this cosmic harmony. To obey the pharaoh was not merely loyalty to a king, It was participation in the divine order that kept the world from collapsing into chaos. The early dynasties established their capital at Memphis, strategically located near the apex of the Nile Delta. From here, pharaohs oversaw great public works, trade with surrounding lands, and the development of art, religion, and writing. By 3000 BCE, the Egyptians had invented hieroglyphics, a complex writing system of over 700 symbols combining pictures, sounds, and ideas. It was used to record prayers, laws, royal decrees, and most importantly, the journey of the soul after death. With writing, Egypt could remember. And with memory came history. The Old Kingdom, Age of the Pyramid Builders. By 2686 BCE, Egypt entered what historians now call the Old Kingdom, an era of immense stability and architectural innovation. The pharaohs of this time sought to express their divine power through colossal structures meant to last for eternity. The first of these monumental projects was the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, built for King Djoser around 2667 BCE. Designed by his brilliant architect Imhotep, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Stacked mastabas, rectangular tombs, rose layer by layer, forming a grand staircase to the heavens. This was not just a tomb. It was a symbol of the king's ascent to join the gods. Imhotep's innovation inspired generations. By the 4th dynasty, pyramid building had evolved into an exact science. Pharaoh Sneferu experimented with designs, constructing the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, perfecting the geometry and engineering required for what came next, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built for Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, around 2560 BCE, this massive structure originally stood 146 meters tall, constructed from more than 2 million limestone blocks. Each block weighed an average of 2.5 tons, some even over 70 tons, and yet the seams between them are so precise that a blade of grass could barely fit between. Modern engineers still debate how ancient Egyptians achieved such perfection without modern machinery or iron tools. Some suggest massive ramps, others intricate counterweight systems, but no one knows for certain. What is clear is that this was not simply an engineering feat. It was a statement of eternal power. To the Egyptians, Khufu's pyramid was not just a tomb. It was a cosmic machine designed to launch his soul into the afterlife. The Giza Plateau soon became a city of the dead, with pyramids for Khafre and Menkaure, and the iconic Great Sphinx, its lion's body and human head gazing eternally toward the rising sun. Life beneath the shadow of the pyramids. While the pyramids stood as symbols of divine power, everyday life along the Nile was a balance of simplicity and devotion. Farmers rose with the sun, planting barley, wheat, and flax along the fertile banks. Craftsmen shaped stone, wood, and copper into tools, jewelry, and statues for both the living and the dead. Priests served as the intermediaries between gods and men, performing rituals to ensure the floods returned, the crops grew, and the dead found peace. Education was prized, but only a few, the scribes, could read and write. Scribes were the memory of Egypt, recording taxes, prayers, and royal decrees on papyrus scrolls made from reeds along the Nile. Their words would outlast empires. Women in Egypt held remarkable rights compared to other ancient societies. They could own property, run businesses, and even divorce. Goddesses like Isis and Hathor reflected this balance, embodying motherhood, love, and divine protection. Through the Old Kingdom, Egypt thrived. Its population grew, trade flourished, and art reached new levels of sophistication. But even the mightiest pyramids couldn't prevent what was to come. By around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom began to crumble. Years of drought weakened the floods, famine spread, and local governors, the nomarchs, grew powerful enough to challenge the pharaohs. Egypt entered a dark age of division known as the First Intermediate Period. But here's the thing, while the pyramids still stood tall, Egypt itself began to fracture. The divine order of Ma'at was breaking. And in the chaos that followed, warlords would rise, kingdoms would fall, and a new kind of Egypt would be born, one ruled not just by faith, but by fear. Stay with me, because what happens next will transform Egypt from a kingdom of stone into a mighty empire of conquest. Legacy of the Dawn. Even in decline, the spirit of the Old Kingdom endured. The concept of the pharaoh as a god, the sacred duty to maintain balance, the vision of life after death, these ideas became the core of Egyptian identity for millennia. They believed that as long as the Nile flowed and Ma'at prevailed, Egypt would never truly die. From the unification under Narmer to the golden age of pyramid building, the foundations of one of humanity's greatest civilizations had been set. The pharaohs of later dynasties would build upon this legacy, expanding Egypt's borders, reshaping its faith, and engraving their names into eternity. In the next chapter, Egypt rises again, stronger, richer, and more ambitious than ever. New kings will turn their gaze beyond the Nile, launching campaigns of conquest across Africa and the Near East. But power always comes at a price. And soon, the same divine system that made Egypt invincible will begin to crack from within. Join me in Part 2, The Age of Empire and Expansion, where we'll uncover the pharaohs who dared to rule the world and the secrets they left behind. Part 2, The Age of Empire and Expansion. When the Old Kingdom collapsed, it seemed as though Egypt had lost its soul. The mighty pyramids still stood, casting long shadows over the desert, but the power behind them had vanished. The divine pharaohs who once claimed to be living gods were gone, replaced by rival warlords, starving farmers, and a land divided by drought and despair. But just as the Nile always returned with its life-giving flood, so too would Egypt rise again. From the ruins of chaos, a new age was about to be born, one that would prove the resilience of the Egyptian spirit and mark the beginning of a powerful new chapter, the Middle Kingdom. The rebirth of order, the Middle Kingdom, around 2055 to 1650 BCE. For more than a century after the fall of the Old Kingdom, Egypt was fractured. The once unified nation had splintered into a patchwork of provinces ruled by local governors, the nomarchs, who cared more about their own wealth than the fate of their people. Trade routes collapsed, famine swept through the land, and the grand pyramids were plundered for stone. Yet in the midst of that darkness, a new light emerged, a man named Mentuhotep II, a ruler from Thebes in Upper Egypt. Around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep waged war against the northern lords, finally uniting Egypt under one crown again. To the Egyptians, his victory was not merely political, it was divine. It symbolized the restoration of Ma'at, the sacred balance that held the universe together. Under Mentuhotep's rule, Egypt began to heal. He became the founder of the 11th dynasty, ushering in a new era of prosperity and peace. Unlike the godlike pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, Mentuhotep and his successors ruled as servants of the people. They saw themselves not as untouchable deities, but as protectors, guardians of justice, providers of stability. Massive irrigation projects, reclaimed farmland lost to drought. Canals were dug, temples rebuilt, and trade with Nubia and the Levant revived. Egyptian art also transformed. Statues no longer depicted flawless gods but realistic humans with lined faces and weary eyes that revealed compassion and mortality. Literature began exploring deeper themes of morality, emotion, and faith. Tombs, once reserved for kings, now featured scenes of ordinary life: farmers harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets, dancers moving to drums. For the first time in Egyptian history, people began to believe that the afterlife was not just for royalty, but for anyone who lived a righteous life. Eternity had become democratic. Egypt had risen from ashes, but with rebirth came ambition. As the Nile brought wealth once more, the pharaohs looked beyond their borders, toward the lands of gold and glory. The expansion southward, Nubia and the quest for gold. To the south lay Nubia, a rugged land of dark mountains and brilliant sunlight, inhabited by proud peoples rich in gold, ivory, and exotic goods. Egypt's desire for these treasures drove them deeper into Nubia than ever before. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian armies and traders moved south, building mighty fortresses along the Nile at Buhen, Semna, and Kuma to secure trade routes and protect their new frontier. These strongholds were more than military bases. They were symbols of Egypt's growing power and ambition. Gold from Nubia flowed north to finance Egypt's temples, palaces, and monuments. The relationship between the two lands was complicated, a mix of trade, cultural exchange, and military domination. In art, Nubians appeared as both partners and rivals, admired for their strength, yet always portrayed under Egypt's shadow. By around 1878 BCE, under Pharaoh Senusret III, Egypt reached the height of its Middle Kingdom power. Senusret was a soldier king, tall, stern-faced, and relentless. He centralized authority, weakening the nomarchs and ensuring that all power flowed directly from the pharaoh's throne. Senusret led repeated campaigns into Nubia, extending Egypt's control farther south than ever before. His engineers carved victory inscriptions deep into the cliffs above the Nile, words that still survive, proclaiming Egypt's glory. Under his reign, Egypt flourished. Trade expanded, art matured, and the concept of kingship evolved into one of wisdom, strength, and justice. Yet, as centuries passed, the foundations of this order began to crack once more. The invasion of the Hyksos, the Second Intermediate Period. Around 1650 BCE, Egypt faced an unexpected enemy, not from the deserts or the south, but from the lands of Canaan in the northeast. They were called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands. At first, they entered peacefully, traders, craftsmen, nomads settling in the fertile delta. But as Egypt's central power weakened, the Hyksos grew stronger, eventually seizing control of northern Egypt and establishing their own dynasty at Avaris. For the first time in history, foreigners ruled Egypt. Yet these outsiders were not mere invaders. The Hyksos brought innovation, horse-drawn chariots, bronze weapons, and composite bows, technologies that Egypt had never seen. They adopted Egyptian customs, called themselves pharaohs, and worshipped local gods. But their rule was a wound to Egypt's pride. To the native Egyptians, the Hyksos represented chaos, proof that the gods had turned away. But in Thebes, far to the south, a new generation of rulers was rising. They refused to bow. Imagine being born in a land ruled by foreigners, watching your sacred temples under strange kings. Would you surrender, or would you fight to reclaim your gods? The rise of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE. That burning pride ignited a revolution. It began with Seqenenretau, a Theban prince who dared to challenge the Hyksos. He died in battle, his skull later found, with deep wounds, silent testimony to his sacrifice. His son Kamosi continued the war, striking at the Hyksos heartland and weakening their control. Finally, around 1550 BCE, came Ahmose I, Seqenenre's younger son. He completed the liberation of Egypt, driving the Hyksos out completely and uniting the land under his rule. With Ahmose's victory, the New Kingdom was born, an era that would transform Egypt from a recovering nation into a global empire. Ahmose reformed the army, expanded the navy, reopened trade routes, and filled Egypt's treasuries once more. But most importantly, he planted the seed of imperial ambition. Egypt would no longer wait for threats, it would march forth to conquer them. This was the dawn of the Age of Empire. The age of conquest and glory, Thutmose I to Thutmose III. Under Thutmose I, Egypt expanded farther than ever before. His armies marched south into Nubia and north into Syria and Palestine, pushing Egypt's borders from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile to the Euphrates River nearly 1,600 kilometers apart. But Egypt's most legendary conqueror was yet to come. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, reigned from 1479 to 1425 BCE. Early in his reign, his stepmother Hatshepsut ruled as regent, and later, astonishingly, declared herself pharaoh. After her death, Thutmose III unleashed Egypt's full might. He led 17 military campaigns, crushing revolts, subduing Canaan and Syria, and turning Egypt into the superpower of the ancient world. Tributes flowed into Thebes' gold, ivory, spices, rare animals, even exotic plants to adorn temple gardens. Yet Thutmose was not just a conqueror. He was a builder and visionary, expanding temples at Karnak, raising obelisks, and inscribing his victories in stone for eternity. Egypt had reached its zenith, its empire vast, its wealth unmatched, its gods supreme. But power always comes with a price. And soon one of Egypt's own would challenge the gods themselves, rewriting history in the name of the sun. If you're still here, you're about to see wonders that will change the way you imagine history, revealing stories hidden beneath the sands for thousands of years. The reign of Queen Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. Among the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, one name still stirs awe: Hatshepsut. She ruled from 1473 to 1458 BCE, not as queen, but as king, donning the royal beard and titles of a male pharaoh. Her reign was one of peace, prosperity, and architectural genius. She reopened trade routes, long abandoned, including the legendary expedition to Punt, a mysterious land believed to be on the Horn of Africa. Her fleets returned with incense trees, gold, and exotic animals, gifts for the gods, and proof of Egypt's divine favor. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into cliffs near Thebes, remains one of Egypt's most breathtaking monuments, an eternal symbol of grace and authority. Yet after her death, her stepson Thutmose III tried to erase her from history, chiseling her name from monuments, smashing her statues. Power, even divine power, was never safe from jealousy. They build empires that touch the sky, but what happens when gods begin to fight each other? In the next episode, one pharaoh will dare to defy 3,000 years of Egyptian religion, destroy the temples of the old gods, and proclaim a single god of the sun. His name was Akhenaten, and his revolution would shake Egypt to its core. Fun 3. Akhenaten, the heretic king and the revolution of the sun. Egypt stood at the height of its power. The empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the borders of Syria and the Euphrates. The temples of Karnak blazed with gold, the gods of Thebes ruled unchallenged, and the pharaoh was seen as the divine link between heaven and earth. For nearly 2,000 years, Egypt's gods had guided its destiny: Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, and dozens more, each commanding their own temples, their own priests, their own wealth. Yet behind the golden mask of prosperity, something was beginning to crack. The temples of Amun had grown so rich that even the pharaoh's power seemed to bend before them. The priests owned vast lands, controlled thousands of laborers, and collected tribute from across the empire. Slowly, Egypt's divine order Ma'at was shifting out of balance again. Then came a man who would dare to change it all. His name was Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, the great dazzling son of the 18th dynasty. Born into luxury and divine heritage, the young prince seemed destined to continue the tradition of his fathers. But deep within him, something burned, an obsession not with many gods, but with one. When Amenhotep III died, the young pharaoh took the throne. He began his reign much like any other ruler. He performed rituals to the gods, maintained the temples, and honored Amun of Thebes. Yet over time, his devotion shifted toward a single divine force, Aten, the radiant disk of the sun. Unlike the distant gods of old, Aten was not a statue in a dark temple, but light itself, visible to all who lived beneath the sky. To the new pharaoh, Aten was not just a god among gods. Aten was the one true source of life. Amenhotep IV soon changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. And with that act, Egypt began one of the most radical revolutions in its history. He ordered new temples built not for Amun, not for Ra, but for Aten, open-air sanctuaries where sunlight streamed down unhindered. The most famous of these was at Karnak, a vast courtyard without roofs, where priests offered incense and hymns beneath the open sky. The pharaoh himself led the worship, appearing not as a distant god-king, but as Aten's living prophet. Akhenaten's imagery was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. He abandoned the traditional stiff, idealized art of earlier pharaohs. Instead, he had himself depicted with long limbs, wide hips, and narrow face, neither fully male nor female, as if to embody both the father and mother of creation. The royal family was shown in intimate scenes, Akhenaten kissing his wife Nefertiti, playing with their daughters beneath the rays of the sun. The sun's hands reached down, each ending in an ankh, the symbol of life, touching the royal faces in blessing. To his followers, it was a vision of divine harmony. To his enemies, it was heresy. As Akhenaten's devotion to Aten deepened, his tolerance for Egypt's old religion vanished. He ordered the name of Amun to be chiseled off monuments, banned the worship of other gods, and closed the great temples of Thebes. The priests of Amun, once the mightiest force in Egypt, found their power stripped away overnight. Even the word gods in the plural was erased from inscriptions. There would be only one God, Aten, and one prophet, Akhenaten. But his revolution was not only spiritual. It was political, economic, and deeply personal. By destroying the temples of Amun, Akhenaten weakened the religious elite who had rivaled the crown for generations. He centralized wealth and authority directly under himself. In his mind, he was restoring divine purity, freeing Egypt from corruption. To symbolize his break with the past, Akhenaten abandoned Thebes, the city of Amun, and built an entirely new capital in the desert. He called it Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, today known as Amarna. It was a city built from nothing, rising like a dream from the sand. Palaces, temples, and villas stood aligned to face the sunrise, their walls painted in bright colors, alive with scenes of daily life. It was a city without shadows, open to the sky, drenched in sunlight, just as Akhenaten believed life under Aten should be. For a brief time, it seemed to work. Artists flourished, poets sang hymns to Aten, and Akhenaten ruled as the world's first monotheist. One hymn, known as the Great Hymn to the Aten, still survives, a beautiful prayer praising the sun's light as the source of all creation. But while Akhenaten basked in his divine vision, the world beyond his golden city began to crumble. Egypt's borders, once secure under Thutmose and Amenhotep III, were now neglected. Reports arrived from Canaan, Syria, and Nubia. Vassal states were rebelling, enemies were advancing, and Egypt's generals begged for help. Yet Akhenaten ignored them. He cared little for war or politics. His entire mind was fixed on Aten. To his subjects, their once mighty empire seemed abandoned. Crops failed, trade declined, and famine crept across the land. Even within Amarna, whispers grew louder. The people began to wonder whether the sun had truly blessed them or cursed them. Nefertiti, his queen, stood beside him through much of this turmoil. She was not only his wife, but his equal, appearing in art almost as often as he did, even smiting Egypt's enemies in symbolic scenes once reserved for kings. Some scholars believe she may have ruled alongside him, or even briefly after his death, under the name Neferneferuaten. But Akhenaten's revolution could not last. After roughly 17 years on the throne, the Pharaoh of the Sun disappeared from history. Some say he died peacefully in his city. Others believe he was overthrown. His successor was a young boy, perhaps his own son Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten. And here, the wheel of Egypt turned once more. Tutankhaten was just a child when he ascended the throne. Under the guidance of his advisors and generals, the boy king reversed his father's policies. The worship of Aten was abandoned, and the old gods were restored. The capital moved back to Thebes, and the boy's name was changed to Tutankhamen, the living image of Amen. The temples reopened, the statues of Amun were rebuilt, and Akhenaten's city of light was left to the desert. The priests, once humbled, returned stronger than ever. Akhenaten's name was erased from monuments, struck from King Lis, his memory condemned. The Egyptians called it damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. To them, he was a heretic, a madman who had betrayed the gods and nearly destroyed Ma'at. And yet, centuries later, the ruins of Amarna would still shimmer under the sun, as if the desert itself refused to forget. Even in his failure, Akhenaten changed something fundamental in Egyptian thought. For the first time, a man had dared to imagine that there was one truth above all others, one divine light that touched all living things. It was a concept far ahead of its time, a whisper of ideas that would echo in future religions long after Egypt's empire had fallen. For those who walked through the abandoned streets of Amarna, the silence was haunting. The painted walls still glowed faintly with color. The altars stood empty beneath the open sky, and the rays of the Aten still fell upon the dust where a dream once lived. The sun had risen on Akhenaten's vision and then set forever, but Egypt would rise again, because its story was far from over. Soon, under the young Tutankhamun and the powerful generals who ruled behind him, Egypt would struggle to reclaim its former glory. And in the generations that followed, the empire would face new threats, betrayals, and the slow fading of its golden age. The gods had returned, but the balance of Ma'at would never be the same again. And as the sun sank beyond the horizon of Amarna, casting its last light over the empty city, one truth remained: even the mightiest of men cannot command the heavens forever. If you're still watching, prepare yourself. The next story will take you even deeper into the mysteries of Egypt, where kings, gods, and forgotten treasures collide. Part 4. The Rise of the New Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. After centuries of foreign domination and inner division, Egypt finally rose again from the ashes. Around the middle of the second millennium before Christ, a powerful ruler named Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos invaders from the Nile Delta and reunited the land. For the first time in generations, the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt were under one crown again. This was the dawn of what historians call the New Kingdom, a time of prosperity, innovation, and empire building, when Egypt reached the very height of its glory. Ahmose I was not only a conqueror, he was also a reformer. He rebuilt temples that had fallen into ruin and reorganized the army, transforming it into one of the most efficient military forces of the ancient world. Under his leadership, Egypt began to look beyond its borders once more. Gold flowed from Nubia, cedarwood from Lebanon, and exotic treasures from lands far away returned to fill the royal palaces of Thebes. The scars of occupation slowly healed, and in their place grew a sense of renewed pride, a conviction that the gods had chosen Egypt to stand forever. After Ahmose came Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, both strong rulers who expanded Egypt's frontiers. But the story of this golden age is not only about kings and conquest, it is also about power, ambition, and sometimes the surprising rise of a woman who would rule as pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was not supposed to be pharaoh. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died young, the throne should have passed to his son, Thutmose III, who was still a child. But Hatshepsut, with intelligence and audacity, stepped forward to rule as regent, and then, astonishingly, as pharaoh in her own right. She took on the full regalia of kingship, even wearing the traditional false beard in statues and reliefs to project divine authority. But Hatshepsut's reign was not about war. She ruled with vision and calm. She restored trade with distant lands, most famously leading a grand expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, possibly located along the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The ships returned laden with gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals. To the Egyptians, it was a sign that the gods had blessed their pharaoh. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt became rich, peaceful, and beautifully adorned. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffs west of Thebes, still stands today, a monument to her unmatched architectural taste and her ambition to be remembered forever. When Hatshepsut passed away, her stepson Thutmose III took the throne and transformed Egypt into an empire. He was a military genius, sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Over 17 campaigns, he expanded Egypt's control deep into Syria and Nubia, establishing a sphere of influence that reached from the Euphrates River to the fourth cataract of the Nile. Tribute poured in from every direction: gold, copper, livestock, and slaves, all displayed proudly in the great temples of Amun at Karnak. Egypt was no longer a regional kingdom. It was now the superpower of the ancient world. But military glory alone could not sustain an empire. With expansion came the challenge of administration and faith. The priests of Amun grew immensely wealthy and powerful, rivaling even the pharaoh's authority. For a time, the balance held until a pharaoh tried to change everything. His name was Amenhotep IV, but history remembers him as Akhenaten the heretic king. Akhenaten broke with centuries of Egyptian tradition. He abandoned the old gods, especially Amun, and proclaimed that there was only one true deity, Aten, the visible sun disk. It was a revolutionary idea, the first major experiment with monotheism in recorded history. Akhenaten even built a new capital city, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna, far from the influence of Thebes and its powerful priests. He renamed himself in honor of the sun god and portrayed himself in art unlike any pharaoh before him, with elongated features, soft curves, and intimate family scenes showing him with his wife, the beautiful Nefertiti, and their daughters. But the revolution came at a cost. While Akhenaten focused on spiritual matters and his devotion to Aten, Egypt's empire began to crumble. Foreign vassals cried for help against invading enemies, but their pleas were ignored. The once mighty army grew idle, and Egypt's wealth started to fade. After his death, chaos and confusion reigned. The court tried to erase his memory, chisel out his name, and restore the old gods. The experiment with Aten was over. It was during this fragile time that a boy king came to the throne, Tutankhamun. Crowned at about 9 years old, Tutankhamun ruled under the guidance of powerful advisors who reinstated the worship of Amun and moved the capital back to Thebes. His reign was short, but his death left behind one of the most astonishing discoveries in history. When archaeologist Howard Carter opened his nearly intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, the world stood in awe. The golden mask of Tutankhamun became a symbol of Egypt itself, a silent face from 3,000 years ago, looking out at the modern world. As the years passed, new kings restored stability and ambition. Among them, one name stands taller than all others: Ramses the Great. Ramses II ruled for more than 60 years, an almost unimaginable span of time in the ancient world. He built colossal temples at Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs of Nubia, to project his power even into the lands he conquered. He led armies northward to confront the mighty Hittite Empire, clashing in the legendary Battle of Kadesh around 1274 before Christ. Although the battle ended in a stalemate, Ramses portrayed it as a grand victory, inscribing his deeds across Egypt in sprawling reliefs. Later, he negotiated what is considered the first recorded peace treaty in human history. Under Ramses, Egypt was wealthy, confident, and full of pride. Massive construction projects reshaped the landscape: temples, statues, obelisks, all bearing his name. He fathered over 100 children and lived long enough to see many of them die before him. To his people, he was not just a man, he was a god among mortals. But even golden ages cast long shadows. After Ramses II, Egypt's strength began to wane. His successors struggled with internal corruption, economic strain, and renewed foreign threats. The power of the priesthood grew again, and the unity of the empire weakened. By the time Ramses XI sat on the throne, the great empire of the new kingdom had begun to fracture. The north and south drifted apart once more, and a new era of uncertainty loomed. Egypt had reached the peak of its glory and was now standing on the edge of decline. Yet even as the temples aged and the power faded, the spirit of the new kingdom endured in stone and story. Its monuments, colossal and eternal, still whispered of a time when human ambition touched the divine, when the Nile carried not just water, but the dreams of a civilization that believed it could live forever. And perhaps, in a way, it did. Stay tuned, because the secrets buried in the sands are far from fully revealed, and the next chapter will challenge everything you thought you knew about this ancient civilization. Part 5. The Decline of the Pharaohs and the Legacy of Egypt. As the sun began to set over the golden sands of Thebes, so too did the power of Egypt begin to fade. The glory that had once stretched from the Euphrates to the heart of Africa was slowly crumbling. The empire that had ruled for centuries found itself caught in a web of intrigue, famine, and invasion. The gods had not abandoned Egypt, but perhaps Egypt had begun to forget how to listen to them. After the death of Ramses II, the once mighty line of pharaohs began to weaken. His successors bore the burden of his monumental legacy, but lacked his commanding vision. Temples still rose, but their stones carried the weariness of repetition rather than the inspiration of divine purpose. Wealth began to drain away, much of it consumed by endless building projects and the cost of maintaining vast armies. Meanwhile, the priesthood of Amun in Thebes grew richer and more powerful than ever, often challenging the pharaohs themselves. By the reign of Ramses XI, around the 11th century before Christ, Egypt had split in spirit, if not yet in form. The northern delta was controlled by military rulers and administrators, while the south fell under the influence of high priests. The once united two lands were once again drifting apart. And into this fracture stepped a new age, the Third Intermediate Period, a time of confusion and divided power. Foreigners began to sense opportunity. From the west came the Libyans, settling in Egypt's fertile lands and eventually rising to power. Their leaders adopted Egyptian customs, spoke its language, and even called themselves pharaohs. Yet despite their efforts, something essential had changed. The authority of the pharaoh was no longer absolute. Egypt had become a kingdom of competing dynasties, each claiming legitimacy while the true spirit of unity slipped further away. By the 8th century before Christ, another shadow fell across the land. From the south, in the region once known as Nubia, a new power had risen, the kingdom of Kush. The Kushite kings saw themselves as the heirs of Egypt's divine tradition. They revered the same gods, built temples in Egyptian style, and sought to restore the ancient glory. When they conquered Egypt and founded the 25th dynasty, it seemed for a moment that the old greatness might return. The Kushite pharaohs, especially King Piye and Taharka, ruled with devotion and strength. They rebuilt temples, revived art, and rekindled the pride of the Nile. But their triumph was short-lived. Far to the northeast, a new empire was growing, fierce, relentless, and hungry for conquest. The Assyrians swept across the Near East, with iron weapons and brutal efficiency. Around 671 before Christ, they invaded Egypt, shattering the Kushite rule and installing their own governors. The age of Egyptian independence was coming to an end. The Assyrians did not stay long, but their invasion opened the floodgates. Soon the Persians arrived, led by the powerful Cyrus the Great, and later Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt in 525 before Christ. The Persians respected Egyptian culture in some ways. They allowed temples to function and priests to perform rituals. But Egypt was no longer free. For the first time, the land of the pharaohs became a province in someone else's empire. Yet even under Persian rule, the Egyptian spirit refused to die. Revolts flared up again and again. Native kings briefly reclaimed the throne during the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, trying to restore independence. But the world had changed. New powers were rising: Greece to the west, Persia to the east, and Egypt's golden isolation was gone forever. In 332 before Christ, the course of Egyptian history took another dramatic turn. A young Macedonian general, only 24 years old, marched across the desert after defeating the Persian armies. His name was Alexander the Great. When he entered Egypt, he was hailed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The priests of Amun crowned him as pharaoh, and the people rejoiced. In their eyes, the gods had sent a new savior. Alexander visited the oracle at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared the son of Amun himself, a divine ruler in the ancient tradition. But Alexander's stay in Egypt was brief. He soon departed to conquer the rest of the known world, leaving behind one of his generals to govern. That general, Ptolemy, would found a dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last great chapter of Egypt's ancient story. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a blend of Greek and Egyptian culture. The new rulers embraced the old religion, built temples in both Greek and Egyptian styles, and portrayed themselves as successors to the pharaohs. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander himself, became a jewel of the ancient world, home to the Great Library, the Lighthouse of Pharos, and scholars who shaped science, mathematics, and philosophy for generations. Egypt was no longer the center of the world, but it was still a land of wonder and knowledge. However, the later Ptolemies were plagued by intrigue and decline, much like the pharaohs before them. Corruption, internal strife, and growing dependence on foreign powers weakened the dynasty. And in the end, it would not be a king who defined its last moment, but a queen, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was intelligent, ambitious, and charismatic beyond measure. She spoke several languages, studied philosophy, and understood the power of image and persuasion. When she took the throne, Egypt was under threat from the expanding might of Rome. Cleopatra sought alliances not with armies, but with men, Julius Caesar first, and later Mark Antony. Her beauty became legend, but her mind was sharper than any myth. For years, she maneuvered Egypt between rival Roman factions, striving to preserve her country's independence. But fate, as always, was merciless. When Antony's forces were defeated by Octavian, the future emperor Augustus, Cleopatra's dream crumbled. In 30 before Christ, faced with capture and humiliation, she ended her life, and with her death, ended 3,000 years of Egyptian monarchy. The Ptolemaic kingdom became a Roman province, and the last echoes of the pharaohs faded into history. Yet Egypt was far from dead. Under Roman rule, its grain fed the empire. Its temples continued to awe visitors. Its gods Isis, Osiris, and Horus spread far beyond the Nile, worshipped even in the distant corners of Europe. And its monuments, carved in stone, endured the passing of empires. As centuries turned to millennia, new religions came and went. Christianity spread through the Roman world, and later, Islam arrived, reshaping the land yet again. But through every change, the legacy of ancient Egypt remained not just in its monuments, but in the imagination of humanity itself. The pyramids still pierced the desert sky. The hieroglyphs still whispered from the walls of tombs. And when explorers and scholars rediscovered these wonders thousands of years later, the world once again fell under Egypt's spell. In 1799, a group of French soldiers under Napoleon uncovered a black basalt stone near the town of Rosetta. The Rosetta Stone, inscribed in 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, would become the key to unlocking Egypt's lost language. When Jean-François Champollion finally deciphered it in 1822, the voices of the ancients spoke again after being silent for more than 1,000 years. Through their words, we learned how Egyptians lived, loved, and dreamed. We learned of their gods, their kings, their triumphs, and their fears. We learned that, to them, life and death were not opposites, but part of a single eternal cycle. To live was to prepare for eternity. To build was to defy time. To remember was to be immortal. And so, even though the line of the pharaohs has long ended, the spirit of Egypt endures. It endures in the stone temples of Luxor, in the silent tombs of the Valley of the Kings, in the gaze of the Sphinx that has watched the desert shift for over 4,000 years. It endures in every child who looks upon those monuments and wonders who built them and why. Because Egypt was never just a place. It was an idea, the idea that humanity could reach for the divine, that order could rise from chaos, that memory itself could defeat death. And as long as that idea lives, Egypt lives too. The Nile still flows, carrying with it the same waters that once reflected the golden crowns of the pharaohs. Its rhythm is eternal, a heartbeat that has never truly stopped. The sands may bury cities, the years may erase names, but Egypt's story continues to be told, in every age, by those who still listen to the whisper of its ancient wind. Don't leave just yet. What comes next will uncover incredible tales of power, betrayal, and discovery. Stories that have been waiting thousands of years to be told. The afterlife of Egypt, rediscovery, and eternal legacy. When Cleopatra's body was laid to rest and the Roman eagles spread their wings over the Nile, it might have seemed that Egypt's story had finally ended. Yet for Egypt, the end was only another beginning, another turn in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that had always defined this land. The Romans came not as destroyers but as heirs. They admired the ancient temples, adopted the gods, and placed their emperors in the same divine lineage that had once crowned the pharaohs. The great city of Alexandria remained one of the jewels of the Roman world. Its harbors were crowded with ships from every corner of the empire, its streets filled with scholars, traders, and priests. The great library may have burned more than once. No one knows exactly when or how, but the spirit of knowledge it represented did not vanish. The Greeks and Romans studied Egyptian science, medicine, and architecture. Even the Romans' own system of religion borrowed symbols and rituals from the Nile. The goddess Isis, once worshipped in the temples of Philae and Dendera, became a universal mother figure across the Mediterranean. Her statue stood not only in Egypt, but in Athens, Rome, and even London. The cult of Isis promised comfort, healing, and eternal life ideals that resonated with millions long after the last pharaoh fell. Egypt had ceased to rule politically, but spiritually, it was conquering the world. As centuries passed, new faiths rose. Christianity spread through Egypt earlier than almost anywhere else. By the 2nd century after Christ, Egyptian Christians, the Copts, were already forming one of the oldest branches of the faith. They wrote in a language descended from ancient Egyptian, preserving echoes of the tongue once spoken by the builders of the pyramids. Monks withdrew to the deserts, founding monasteries that still stand today, carrying forward the old Egyptian love of eternity through the new lens of salvation. When Islam arrived in the 7th century, it brought both transformation and continuity. The Arab conquerors admired the monuments they found, colossal temples half buried in sand, the pyramids rising like mountains against the horizon. They called them the Pyramids of the Pharaohs, and their travelers wrote of them with awe and wonder. Cairo, the new capital, grew into one of the world's greatest cities, a meeting place of East and West, of the ancient and the modern. The old gods slept beneath the sand, but their legacy whispered through art, architecture, and legend. For 1,000 years, the secrets of ancient Egypt lay hidden. The hieroglyphs became mere decoration, their meanings forgotten. The temples were swallowed by desert winds, the tombs sealed by shifting dunes. Travelers spoke of buried cities and treasures guarded by curses, but no one could read the words carved in stone. Egypt had become a mystery again, as if the gods themselves had drawn a veil over their past. That veil began to lift in the late 18th century. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought not only soldiers but scholars, artists, and scientists. Their mission was to record and study every ancient ruin they could find. The result was the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a vast encyclopedia that revealed the country's wonders to the world for the first time in modern history. But the greatest discovery of all came a year later, in a small town near the Nile Delta, a dark slab of stone inscribed with 3 scripts. The Rosetta Stone was the key. Written in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, it offered the first real chance to unlock the language of ancient Egypt. For 2 decades, scholars struggled to understand it. Then, in 1822, a young French linguist named Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code. When he stood before the Académie des Inscriptions in Paris and declared, "Je tiens l'affaire," I've got it, history changed forever. The walls of the temples began to speak again. The pharaohs, silent for 2 millennia, found their voices. From that moment, Egyptology was born. Adventurers, archaeologists, and dreamers flocked to the Nile. Some came for knowledge, others for glory, and a few for greed. They dug through sand and stone, pried open tombs, and brushed away centuries of dust. Each discovery pulled another thread of Egypt's story back into the light. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter made the most famous discovery of all, the tomb of Tutankhamun, the Boy King. When Carter opened the sealed doorway and held a candle to the darkness, he saw gold everywhere. Furniture, chariots, statues, and the glittering mask that has since become the face of Egypt itself. "Can you see anything?" his patron, Lord Carnarvon, asked. Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." That moment ignited a new global obsession with ancient Egypt. The treasures of Tutankhamun toured the world, dazzling millions. Movies, novels, and art drew on the imagery of mummies and gods. Egypt's past became a bridge between myth and reality, a reminder that the grandeur of human civilization can outlast time itself. But the true miracle was not gold or glory, it was knowledge. Archaeology began to evolve from treasure hunting into science. Egyptian scholars took the lead, reclaiming their heritage. Excavations revealed not only tombs of kings, but homes of ordinary people, showing how farmers, artisans, and children had lived thousands of years ago. We learned that the builders of the pyramids were not slaves, as once believed, but skilled workers honored for their craft. We learned that Egyptian medicine used techniques still recognizable today. We learned that their sense of justice, beauty, and balance, their ma'at, had shaped every part of their world. And through these discoveries, something remarkable happened. The ancient Egyptians stopped being distant figures of myth. They became human again. Their letters spoke of love and longing, their prayers of hope and fear, their art of laughter and sorrow. They were people who dreamed of eternity and, in some way, achieved it. In modern Egypt, the echoes of that heritage remain alive. The temples of Luxor and Abu Simbel rise as proudly as they did in the time of Ramses. The pyramids at Giza still command the horizon, watching over Cairo's sprawl. Each year, millions come to stand before them, pilgrims not of religion, but of wonder. For every visitor who gazes up at those ancient stones feels the same awe the Egyptians felt for their gods. Yet Egypt's story is not only about the past. The modern nation has carried its legacy into the present, a blend of ancient pride and contemporary strength. Egyptian scientists, artists, and thinkers continue to draw inspiration from the world's oldest civilization. The Nile still sustains life, as it has for thousands of years. And every generation adds its own verse to the song that began in the shadow of the pyramids. Perhaps that is why Egypt continues to capture the world's imagination. It is not just the grandeur of its monuments or the mystery of its tombs, but the idea that behind it all lies a vision of what humanity can become: builders of beauty, seekers of meaning, guardians of time. The Egyptians believed that as long as one's name is spoken, the soul lives on. And today, we speak those names again: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramses, Cleopatra, keeping their spirits alive across oceans and millennia. The story of Egypt is, in the end, a story about us. It asks what we will leave behind. It reminds us that power fades, but creativity endures, that empires crumble, but ideas are eternal. It whispers that even in death, there can be rebirth, not only for nations, but for humanity itself. As the Nile glimmers under the same sun that shone on the pharaohs, the wind carries their voices still. They speak not in commands or prophecies, but in a simple truth that echoes through the ages. We built to be remembered. And so we are. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining this incredible journey through the mysteries of ancient Egypt. But stay with us, because what comes next will uncover secrets that even time itself almost forgot. Across the endless sands of the Nile, time has spoken not through words, but through stone, through light, through the silent endurance of a civilization that refused to fade. From the dawn of the Old Kingdom, when the first pharaohs commanded the earth to rise into pyramids, to the twilight of empire when foreign kings claimed the double crown, Egypt lived and still lives in the rhythm of eternity. Every grain of sand along the Nile carries a whisper of genius. The builders who raised Giza against the heavens, the priests who charted the stars to read the will of the gods, the artists who carved eternity into stone. They all believed that life was only one chapter of a longer story. To them, death was not an end, but a continuation. That belief, more than gold or power, gave Egypt its immortality. For over 3,000 years, the Nile was not merely a river, it was a lifeline, a spine of civilization. Upon its banks, the people of Kemet learned to master agriculture, mathematics, medicine, and architecture. They invented writing to speak to the future. They measured time by the rising and falling of celestial bodies. Even as the world changed around them, they kept their gaze fixed on something larger, the eternal balance between order and chaos, between life and death, between man and the divine. Empires rose and fell beyond Egypt's borders, yet the land of the Nile endured. The faces of its rulers changed: Hatshepsut, the queen who ruled as king; Thutmose, the conqueror; Akhenaten, the dreamer of one god; Ramses, the builder of monuments that defied the ages. Each of them left behind more than monuments. They left lessons. Lessons about ambition, belief, love, and the fragile power of human legacy. And then, silence. Centuries of sand swept across temples, tombs, and cities. The words of the pharaohs vanished into myth. For a time, Egypt slept. But the past has a strange way of awakening. When explorers and scholars rediscovered the Rosetta Stone, when Howard Carter's candle first touched the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the world gasped not just at the beauty, but at the reminder that nothing truly great ever disappears. Egypt had returned, reborn from its own dust. Today, as we walk among the ruins of Luxor or gaze at the pyramids through the digital lens of a modern age, we are not looking at the remains of something lost. We are standing before a mirror of humanity's greatest dream, the dream to be remembered, to create something that outlasts our breath. Egypt's story is not only history, it is prophecy. It tells us that even the mightiest fall, but ideas endure, that the stone may crumble, but the spirit of creation never dies. The civilization that began with a single river ended by shaping the entire world. In every clock that measures time, in every calendar that guides our days, in every thought of life beyond death, Egypt is still there, quietly watching, gently reminding. So as we leave this journey behind, let us remember, the sands of time do not bury greatness. They preserve it. And somewhere, beneath the golden horizon of the Nile, the heart of Egypt still beats steady, timeless, eternal. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient Egypt, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our next adventure. We'd love to hear from you. Which historical era or country should we explore next on the channel?